This is Conor Lennon from UN News. The UN is focused on dealing with the problems of today, but we also are thinking about the threats and opportunities of the future. What kind of future do we all want to live in? How can we make sure it's safer and fairer for people and the planet as a whole? Well, we've been pondering these huge topics since the birth of the UN, but there's a growing sense that many of the structures that were set up back then, just after the Second World War, are no longer working well in what was a very different world. Back in the post-war period, there were fewer countries, for example. Many of the nations that exist today were colonies back then. There are regular complaints now that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council really don't reflect the geopolitical realities of today. The climate crisis wasn't on the agenda in the early days, but it is now one of the big existential problems that need to be addressed at an international level. Another existential challenge that didn't trouble too many people back then was AI. Research into artificial intelligence did begin in the 1950s, but it's only in the last few years that we've been able to actually use AI tools. Well, this year, the United Nations is inviting global leaders to consider a wide range of ideas for how to improve the way the world is governed, to safeguard our future for the present and coming generations. And here to talk to me about all that is Michele Griffin, the Policy Director of the Summit of the Future, which will take place at UN headquarters in New York on the 22nd and the 23rd of September. Now, I went through a list of some of the things that we have to worry about now that perhaps we didn't think about so much then. Pandemics, cooperation out of space, mis and disinformation online. The UN brief, it's fair to say, has expanded over time. So take me back to how you and your team, your colleagues, started to try and wrestle with some of these huge ideas.
Sure, thanks, Conor. The idea for the Summit of the Future really emerged in the context of the 75th anniversary of the UN, which, as you may recall, occurred during the kind of first year of the COVID pandemic. And I think what we realized as COVID was taking hold was that for the first time, really since the founding of the UN, everyone in the same world was facing the same threat at the same time. And what's more, frankly, the way we were solving the problem together and cooperating to address its impacts really wasn't, kind of good enough. And we all know the story of the ways in which we failed to kind of come together to, kind of address COVID fairly and quickly and effectively in a way that everyone in the world had the same kind of access to the vaccine and support as others. So I think we really felt that it was a moment to ask member states to think pretty hard about exactly the things you've mentioned, the ways in which we are struggling to address the problems of today and tomorrow with the structures of yesterday, in a sense. And we really need to look at the how of international cooperation to position ourselves to be able to both manage the risks that are coming at us fast and furious in the future and already today, but also to harness the opportunities of a very rapidly changing world in a way that is fair and equitable and sustainable, so that we spread the benefits more widely as opposed to hoarding them for the few.
So when you go back to the we, that's we as member states, international community, and also we as the UN. And just to talk about the UN for a while, I have this sense that as the years, the decades went by, a new problem would arise and we would tack on an agency or tack on another UN body to try and tackle that and basically do it as we went along. Is that part of the problem? Have we kind of grown into this outsized beast, if you will, this outsized tanker, and it's quite hard to kind of change course?
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as a problem, but I think it is certainly something we need to come to grips with, which is that the way in which we are structured, whether that's the Security Council and the General Assembly and their mandates, or the various UN agencies, funds and programs. In a sense, we mirror how ministries in capitals are also structured. You have your health ministry, you have your development ministry, your foreign affairs ministry, your treasury. So the way in which all of us are organized, which is indeed quite a kind of let's say a dated way, isn't really how problems or opportunities are going to manifest themselves in the future. And I think that's exactly what we saw with COVID. It's what we saw also with the impacts of Ukraine. It's what we are seeing with a lot of the crises, but also the opportunities that are presenting themselves these days. And I think that the message of the Common Agenda report, which was the original report that proposed a Summit of the Future, was to say that we really have to kind of think differently and organize ourselves a little differently to be able to cope with these risks and opportunities more effectively in the future. And that doesn't mean changing all of our structures, but it does mean recognizing how problems have evolved, recognizing how opportunities are presenting themselves, and being flexible and agile enough to be able to manage the problems, seize the opportunities in a more effective way. It also means thinking differently about the world and about human progress. I mean, one of the ideas we have in there, for instance, is that we have to get beyond just GDP as a way of talking about and measuring human progress, because that doesn't capture planetary well-being. It doesn't capture many aspects of human well-being. It counts as a positive, things like overfishing and deforestation. And so we understand now that many of our measures of progress are not really progress if you think about the health of the planet and the health of everybody and people's well-being. I think the other major issue here is trust. The kind of fundamental ingredient of international cooperation isn't actually the structures that we've got, because I think if you look at how we've responded to crises over time, very often we make the best of structures that weren't designed for that particular crisis. Where there's a will, we can always do that, and we have done. If you look at the response, for instance, to Ebola, using a lot of our peacekeeping machinery and missions in the field, we are able in the UN, and have always been, to innovate and really respond to challenges as they present themselves. But we can really only do that when we trust each other to work together using whatever structures we've got. So I would say that there are lots of ways in which our structures are dated, and we do have to think differently about the changing nature of war, of peace, of all of the kind of fields of human activity, but I don't think that those structures are stopping us responding effectively. I think that's much more about the trust and solidarity that's at the heart of international cooperation.
But if we talk about the Security Council in particular, that is a part of the UN that is probably one of the best known ones that there's been a lot of controversy about, particularly in recent months. The resolutions vetoed on Gaza, vetoed by America, vetoed by Russia, vetoed by different members of the permanent five of the Security Council. I mean, that is one, isn't it, where many member states could legitimately say, look, this was set up right after the war. It's no longer fit for purpose. So is that something that, there's been talk of reform for decades, as you know. Is that something that we could realistically expect some change to come from as a result of these ideas that you're putting forward?
Well, for sure, the summit is hoping to deliver some kind of step forward on Security Council reform. Obviously, it's a very difficult nut to crack if we're only talking about the composition of the council or the use of the veto. But I do think that there's a massive upswell in recognition on the part of member states themselves, including the P5, that some form of change is needed. And the Secretary General has certainly been very clear that he thinks that change is needed to the composition of the council so that it is more trusted and more effective and more legitimate in the eyes of the people that it's trying to serve. But I think it's also important to think beyond just the Security Council, because again, many of the most consequential and existential challenges and problems that we're going to face in the future are not necessarily the kinds of challenges that the Security Council was designed to solve. They're not necessarily peace and security challenges in the first instance. Think about climate change. So a lot of the ideas that we've put on the table in this summit are not only about looking at these existing structures and trying to think about how we can reform or adapt them to a new world, but also about how we, again, flexibly use all of the structures and pull all of the actors together who can be part of solving these problems. So, a big through thread of the ideas in the Common Agenda report and in this summit are really about ideas around networked inclusive multilateralism. And what we mean by that is, how do we bring all of the actors together that have the power to solve problems and shape people's lives. It's not just about states anymore. It's about private actors who have immense power in the world today. When you think about climate change and energy transitions and the fossil fuel industry, for instance, or when you think about our information ecosystem and misinformation and disinformation and the role of social media platforms, for instance, or you think about the private actors who now have the capacity to be up in space. So, one idea in the summit is an emergency platform which would kind of allow us to convene all of the different actors across many sectors to bring to bear all of the power and energy and resources that...
Like a kind of rapid reaction force.
Certainly not a force, but it's essentially...
Not in a military term, but in terms
Right.
of bringing the people from around the system together to deal with a crisis in a very short space of time.
Exactly. It's really about using the UN's convening power in a way that is suitable to today's challenges and problems, and also to a much more diverse landscape of actors. So the whole point of this summit is really about adapting the international architecture to the political and economic and social realities of today and to the problems and opportunities that we're going to face in the future.
Okay, well, the Summit of the Future is taking place at UN headquarters on the 22nd and 23rd of September. Simple logistical question. How on earth are you going to fit all that into 2 days?
Well, because it's not just 2 days. First, it's actually 4 days because we're holding 2 action days, multi-stakeholder action days before the formal summit to bring together all of those different kinds of actors, as I mentioned. But also this has been a conversation that's been going on already for 3 years. So, a huge amount of work and thinking and mobilizing has already happened. We'll be in Nairobi next week at a big civil society conference where over 4,000 civil society organizations are coming together to give us their inputs for the summit. And of course, the summit will not be the end of the story. In many ways, it'll be the beginning of the story, because hopefully the pact that the summit will produce will contain big signals and big kind of directions of travel on many issues that, will continue to be talked about and on which progress will continue to be made after the summit itself.
Okay, and are there any particular topics, any particular parts of the summit that you're looking out for or that we should be looking out for?
Sure. I mean, I am very keen on the thinking around future generations and how do we adapt our decision making to take account of future generations, understanding now that we affect them and actually are harming them in many of the decisions we make. So there'll be a declaration on future generations that looks to put in place practical mechanisms for how we take them into account. There will be a global digital compact, which looks at the full gamut of developments with respect to digital technology and AI. How do we harness all of the benefits and all of the advances that those developments kind of can offer people for the vast majority of humanity and not just for the few, but also how do we manage the risks that those developments have created, whether that's with respect to weaponization of AI, lethal autonomous weapons, even weaponization of outer space, militarization of outer space. Outer space is another good example. It used to be that very few countries had the capacity to be up there. We now have countless countries with the capacity to be up there, private actors as well. How do we manage all of the space traffic, the space debris, the exploration? How do we do that in a way that, again, benefits the majority of humanity and not just the few? And also, how do we manage the risks? How do we prevent an arms race up in outer space? So there's a lot in the summit that I think is very exciting, but there are also some things there that where we really have to address long-standing issues that prevent us cooperating effectively because they prevent us rebuilding the trust that we've lost in each other. So it's definitely a mix of the old and the new, and of adapting this, old architecture to very new threats, but also new opportunities.
Well, we'll be digging into many of those topics over the coming weeks. Michele Griffin, thank you very much for coming in today, and we look forward to talking to you a little nearer the time.
Great, thank you.